I am very pleased to welcome all of you. I already recognize quite a few of your faces from some of the previous events we had, and I knew from what I've seen in my first few months here at AU that we have an enthusiastic audience of students, of faculty, and of community, but I must admit I didn't realize how enthusiastic our audiences are and how many people come to all of these events. So I'm really grateful for your interest, for your continuous interest, and I apologize for any inconveniences if people, I guess everyone who's in now has a seat, and we had to turn away quite a few people. We had to change the location. For those of you who have been here for the first lecture in our series, we didn't get the Katzen Arts Center today, but for the next lecture in November, we will be back in the museum in the Katzen Arts Center. I really appreciate your enormous interest in our lecture series and all our events. I promise you that together with Laura Cutler, who I want to thank for all the preparations she put into these week's and other events, I really promise you we will continue to organize activities like this one. This and next week alone, I think we have activities basically going on every single day. They would not be possible without your generous support. I know that quite a few in this room helped to make this possible, and I hope you will continue to help it possible. For those of you who are not signed up yet on our list, you can do so afterwards, and we will keep you informed about what's going on. I'm also grateful for the generous support of the Israel Institute for this lecture series and also of the of Jewish Studies, and I'm happy that Pam Nadell, the chair of the History Department, is here tonight as well. A lecture series on the founders of Israel would of course not be complete without a lecture on David Ben-Gurion. He was literally the founder of the state, and he, of course, read the Declaration of Independence of Israel. If you fly into Israel today, most people don't say, I fly into Tel Aviv or I fly into Lod as it once used to be, but I fly into Ben-Gurion. So in a way, Ben-Gurion, the airport, and Ben-Gurion, the man, has become synonymous with Israel, and that for good reason. Ben-Gurion was more than just the first prime minister of the state of Israel. He was its visionary, and he never was satisfied with just creating another state. He remained an idealist, and I wonder what his vision would have been today. Maybe we'll hear a little bit more, or we can ask Professor Shapira afterwards. Ben-Gurion once wrote, "The state of Israel will be judged not by its wealth or its military strength, nor by its technology, but by its moral worth and human values. We must make one more tremendous and concerted effort to become like all other people, at least. But to be that, a normal, vigorous, free, and sovereign state is not easy. By setting up the state, we guarantee to embrace the belief that merely to be like all other peoples is not enough." Ladies and gentlemen, a lecture series on Israel would not be complete without Anita Shapira as a speaker. She is today what we might call the doyenne of Israeli historiography. Born in Warsaw, Poland, she immigrated as a child to Mandate, Palestine. At an early age, she grew up in Tel Aviv, where she studied and where she spent, I think, the very largest part of her career, both as a student and as a young researcher and as a professor at Tel Aviv University. In 2000, she was appointed head of the Chaim Weizmann Institute for the Study of Zionism in Israel at Tel Aviv University. Her public role in Israeli society is by far not restricted, though, to the usual boundaries of academia. Since 2008, she has been the director of the Israel Democracy Institute. Founder? No. Part of it? Okay. She was president of the Memorial, she was part of the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. She founded, I think that is correct, the Yitzhak Rabin Center, and she served as its first director. Professor Shapira received, I think it's correct too to say, almost every single prestigious award in the area of humanities in the State of Israel. Maybe the most important one, the Israel Prize for Jewish History in the year 2008. Among her numerous books, most of which are translated into English, let me just mention 3 biographies of Ber Katznelson, Yigal Allon, and Yosef Chaim Brenner, as well as her standard work on land and power, the Zionist resort to force. Her most recent book, Israel, A History, published last year, is today generally considered the definitive history of the State of Israel. At the book launch in Washington earlier this year, Ambassador Michael Oren recommended that every course on modern Israel should use this book. At the moment, Professor Shapira is writing a new short biography of David Ben-Gurion, and we're very much looking forward to see some of the fruits of her labor, hear about them today, and we welcome Anita Shapira to American University.
No. We'll manage. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Michael, for the generous presentation. And without much ado, let's go and talk about Ben-Gurion. Do you hear me? Yes. Okay. David Ben-Gurion died in December 1973. It was a most inauspicious time for him to pass away. Israel was suffering the shock of the Yom Kippur War, mourning its fallen and fearful about the future. People paid scant attention to the passing of the founding father, the man who had taken Jewish history by storm and established the Jewish state. It was a low-key ending to a turbulent life, rich with expected and unexpected high points. Ben-Gurion chose not to be buried on Mount Herzl, the national mausoleum reserved for leaders of the state, where Theodor Herzl lies, but atop a high cliff overlooking Wadi Tzin and the Negev desert. He asked that his gravestone be inscribed with only the dates of his birth and death, and the words immigrated to the land of Israel in 1906. Nothing more. Do his choice of burial place, not along the nation's great heroes, and the self-effacing inscription attest to humility in the face of death? Ben-Gurion was a man of simple manners, dressed simply, lived modestly, who was accessible to every man and woman, who corresponded with thousands of citizens and mingled with the public without fear or restraint. I found one letter, very interesting letter, from a young, impudent Boy Scout of 13 from Jerusalem to him, named Amos Oz. At the same time, He was fully aware of his worth and knew his historical importance. But in Jewish tradition, there is an accepted titular hierarchy. Rabbi is higher than Rav. Rabban is higher than Rabbi. But highest of all is the one whose untitled name is sufficient. Gadol mi Rabban Shmo. Ben-Gurion chose for himself a unique commemorative site, far from the national mausoleum, so that people would make a special pilgrimage to his grave, and to his alone. Non-mention of his deeds on the gravestone was intended to say, his name is enough, and the rest will be told in the history of Israel. There are leaders regarding whom it was clear from their early youth that they were destined for greatness. This was not the case with Ben-Gurion. He was born in a remote town to a humble family, which teetered between modest comfort and poverty, which trod the fine line between tradition and modernity, and could not afford to send its children to acquire high school education. The start of Ben-Gurion's journey into the big world was inauspicious. Unlike Dr. Theodor Herzl or Chaim Weizmann, who came from middle-class families, had a university degree, and acquired a profession that ensured their livelihood without having to be dependent on the Zionist organization, Ben-Gurion did not have a life outside politics. He did not study and had no profession. Before discovering political activity, he was a young man without a purpose. When he did discover it during the first Russian Revolution of 1905, his life was suddenly given a direction, a purpose, meaning. He used to mention two books that directed him in the two major venues of his life, Zionism and socialism. The first Hebrew novel, Abraham Mapus' Ahavat Zion, Love of Zion, and the second book you will know, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is difficult to ascertain whether this presentation of his conversion was late rationalization or actually reflected the reality. If the latter, it reflected the naivete of a small-town boy, not exposed to the more sophisticated writings of either Zionism or socialism. As a young man, he spoke Russian and read the great Russian novels, modern Hebrew literature and poetry, and admired poets Bialik and Chernyakhovsky. Yet he was always drawn more to philosophy, and early on discovered Nietzsche and the vitalistic concepts popular at the turn of the century in their Hebrew translation. Since his adolescence, his great love was reserved for Plato and Spinoza, whose works he admired all his life. In the last 40 years of his life, he read very little fine literature, but a great deal on philosophy, Jewish studies, history, political science, political thought. Since the 1950s, he was fascinated by Buddhism. All of Israel's legations were employed in buying books for him. In his will, he bequeathed his library to the state, which contained more than 18,000 books and many thousands of booklets. As Prime Minister, he saw himself not only as being responsible for the state's political and military well-being, but also for fostering culture. In 1950, a year of mass immigration to Israel, when the economy tottered under the pressure. He found the means and the time to initiate a project of microfilming Hebrew manuscripts from all over the world and bringing them to Israel, which he described as ingathering those exiles of the spirit of Israel dispersed in the diaspora. These microfilms became the basis for the archives of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. He later initiated another vast enterprise, translating all of humankind's spiritual treasures into Hebrew, from Europe, America, Asia. This was done under the auspices of a very respectable committee in which professors Martin Buber and Hugo Bergman took part. He always found the time to participate in the meetings of this committee, but did not dictate its choices. He proposed, by the way, the translation of Darwin's The Origin of Species to Hebrew. But apart from that, he asked to translate Aeschylus and so on and so forth. He was fascinated by the idea of bringing into the new state all the finest products of humanity, and did not shy away when religious Jews reproached him for claiming that Israel has a lot to learn from non-Jewish thinkers. During his years in office, 4 new universities were built, and the 3 older institutions of higher learning were further developed despite economic dire straits. His idea of Israel as a light unto the nations meant, among other things, the development of study and science. He did not feel inferior to the professors with whom he conducted an ongoing discussion on Plato, on Spinoza, the Bible, Indian philosophy, ethics. Since the early days of statehood, he initiated an ongoing dialogue with Israel's leading scholars. He loved intellectual cut and thrust, and it seemed that sometimes he viewed it as a refuge from the monotony of political routine. On the other hand, he had scant respect for experts. They are experts on what had happened in the past, not on what will be in the future, he retorted when rejecting their recommendations. When a committee of experts determined that there was no possibility of building a modern city in Beersheba, the director of his office asked him, "What do we do now?" "Well," he replied, "let's have a new committee." Ben-Gurion was not born Ben-Gurion. He underwent a long apprenticeship before blazing his trail into public awareness. First of the Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv, then the World Zionist Organization, and only later the entire world. During the period of Ottoman rule, despite being involved in Zionist socialist activity in Palestine, he did not leave his mark. It was after his return to Palestine from his exile in the United States during World War I that he began to gain prominence in his political activity when he was already in his middle 30s. He served as Secretary General of the Histadrut Labor Federation for 15 years. He was a militant workers' leader who did not flinch from confrontation with employers or rival workers' organizations, such as the rightist revisionist organization. During this period, he viewed the Histadrut as the Yishuv's most important organization, the body that had undertaken the mission of building the country. He saw a complete match between the workers' interest, which mandated providing them with employment at a decent wage, and the Zionist interest. If the workers were not absorbed into the country, the Zionist foothold would not be established and the Jewish state would not come about, he contended. During that period, he was not averse to violent street clashes between members of the Histadrut and its adversaries on the right. In 1933, and he already in his late 40s, Ben-Gurion made one of the most important decisions of his life. He embarked on an election campaign with the aim of attaining hegemony in the Zionist movement for the workers. Two political streams were in the ascendancy, labor and the right-wing revisionists, led by Vladimir Jabotinsky. The question was, who would win the majority in the next Zionist Congress? It was against this backdrop that a dramatic election campaign was held in Poland, where there were millions of Jews, the largest source of potential voters to the Zionist Congress. It was there that, for the first time, a characteristic of Ben-Gurion's mode of operation came to the fore. He identified the objective, defined the tools for achieving it, and then went into action with all the force he could muster. The objective, a workers' majority in the elections in Eastern Europe. The tools, enlisting the members of the youth movements, enthusiastic, energetic, young volunteers, instead of the older and tired party activists. Then, for 3 months, he crisscrossed Poland, Galicia, and the Baltic states, speaking in a different town each day, meeting with people and with the young volunteers, reprimanding, supporting them, urging, encouraging. In the end, he achieved 44% of the votes to the Congress, almost a majority. Thus began Labor's hegemony that lasted until 1977. This was a transitional moment in Ben-Gurion's career, from workers' leader to Zionist leader. He was still immature, still prepared to clash with the revisionists in street fights in Tel Aviv. But he was gradually exposed to the more important things. He was elected chairman of the Zionist Agency political department and discovered the world of diplomacy as he held talks with the British High Commissioner, Sir Arthur Walkup. Despite his long-winded speeches, which apparently tried Walkup's patience, the new, energetic Zionist leader impressed him. Ben-Gurion attempted to negotiate with the Arabs of Palestine and was not discouraged by his failures. He was still sufficiently inexperienced to believe that if he were sincere and honest and offered the Arabs development, modernization, and parity in government, they would agree to Jewish immigration. Only after 2 years of futile attempts, he realized that in the best case, they were prepared for the Jews to be a small minority in Palestine, whereas he was not prepared to relinquish the dream of a Jewish state. This, too, was part of Ben-Gurion's apprenticeship, understanding that he could not achieve everything that he wanted. In 1937, a proposal to partition Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state was first tabled. The proposal came from the British Royal Commission of Inquiry, headed by Lord Peel, which visited Palestine in the wake of the Arab Revolt. It was the first time that a concrete proposal had been made regarding the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, small but independent. Ben-Gurion viewed it as an extraordinary opportunity, a seminal moment in the long history of the Jewish people. Completely agitated, he was unable to sleep for weeks. In the end, after a long and tortuous process, the British abandoned the plan and adopted an anti-Zionist policy instead. But from that time on, he saw the idea of partition as the right compromise with the Arabs, which would enable the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. It seems that leaders have a time or mission predestined by history. Thus, in the 1930s, Churchill was considered a failed leader who switched parties several times, was on the margins of political activity, and with his belligerent stance against Hitler, appeared to be a warmonger. Then the picture changed with the outbreak of the World War, and Churchill became one of the most important leaders of the 20th century. De Gaulle fulfilled a historic mission during World War II when he formed the Free French forces that fought the Vichy regime. After the war, he was sent to the political wilderness until he was called back to save France from the Algerian War in 1958. Ben-Gurion, too, had its moment in history. 1942 saw the beginning of the decade which I call Ben-Gurion's magnificent decade. In those years, he envisaged the establishment of the state and that it would involve war, prepared the tools to cope with this eventuality, directed the War of Independence, Israel's bitterest war, decided on mass immigration that within 3 years doubled Israel's population, transferred the capital to Jerusalem despite UN decision on internationalization. This is in addition to his decision to move Israel from neutrality to the Western camp, to initiate the reparations agreement with West Germany, etc., etc., etc. That decade began with his 1941 trip to the United States, where he arrived completely unknown. No one awaited him at the port, and an immigration officer could not comprehend why this Jew from Palestine had come to the United States. So he was detained in Ellis Island for several days. But a few months later, he already formulated the Zionist plan of action for the wartime period. The Zionist war objective was the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Enlisting American support was imperative. But the American State Department supported the British Foreign Office's anti-Zionist policies. Now the president, while President Roosevelt was not anti-Zionist, he thought that Palestine was too small to solve the problem of millions of Jews. Ben-Gurion asserted that it was essential to change his position, and in order to do that, American Jewry had to be organized as a pressure group that would exert its influence on intellectuals, labor union leaders, and churches. Once public opinion supported the idea of a Jewish state, the president would be compelled to follow suit. The road to the White House passes through the American people, he declared. There was only a small problem: how to achieve it. The Jews of America, which had recently entered the war following the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, were apprehensive lest the war be presented as a Jewish war and objected to any action that might hurt the president. They would change their position once the scope of the Holocaust became known. At this stage, however, Ben-Gurion's attempt to form a united front of American Jewry ended in failure. But the direction had been set out. The Conference of American Zionists held at the Biltmore Hotel in New York in April 1942 declared that the Jewish people's war objective was the establishment of a state in Palestine. For Ben-Gurion, this constituted a plan of action, not just an empty declaration. No one knew if and when the Jewish state would come into being. The British were determined to keep their anti-Zionist policy, and after the war, with the rise of the Labour Party to power, they even hardened this line. Nevertheless, Ben-Gurion was convinced that the state would be established soon, and its establishment would involve war with the Arabs. In the summer of 1945, while the war with Japan still went on, he took a step which he later viewed as one of the three most important things he had done in his life. The other two were his immigration to Palestine in 1906 and the Declaration of Independence. In New York, he convened a day-long meeting of several dozen wealthy Jews from all over America. He explained to them that a Jewish state would indeed be established soon and that a war would ensue not only against the local Arabs, but against the Arab states. At that time, just to get the perspective, neither the Arabs nor the Jews imagined that the British would indeed leave Palestine, not to mention an invasion by the Arab countries. The Jews could win, he declared, but they needed arms. In America, the sale of military surplus for scrap had begun, and equipment for a military industry in Palestine could be purchased at a very low price. Ben-Gurion asked those present to set up a special fund for this procurement. All those present agreed, and the Sonborn Foundation, named after the man in whose house the meeting was held, was created. The machines purchased were shipped to Palestine, dismantled and camouflaged as spare parts and agricultural machinery, and then reassembled. This machinery was the foundation stone of Israel's military industries. After the Second World War, the Jewish people was at its lowest point. 6 million Jews had perished. In Palestine, the British ruled with an iron fist and prevented Jewish refugees from entering the country. It was a situation that drove many people to despair. Not Ben-Gurion. He identified the forces at his disposal: the Yishuv, which was prepared to fight the British, the Jewish community in America, which would exert political pressure on the president, and the Jewish refugees in the displaced persons camps in Germany, who would not allow the problem to be removed from the international agenda. He activated 3 channels of action. In Palestine, the Jewish resistance movement was formed, which sabotaged British facilities in order to demonstrate that they would be unable to rule without an agreement with the Jews. In America, Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver from Cincinnati turned the Jewish minority into an ethnic pressure group whose weight began to be felt in American politics. And in Germany, Ben-Gurion visited the DP camps, the only Jewish leader to do so, where he met with the Jewish refugees, raised their spirits, and assured them that they would soon emigrate to Palestine. The illegal immigration he organized, which the British tried to halt, kept the subject on the international agenda, much to the frustration of the British, who hoped that the refugees would despair and return to the bloodlands in Eastern Europe. These three pressures led the British to the decision to take the question of Palestine to the United Nations. And the rest is history. It seems to us today that the decision on the establishment of the state on the 14th of May 1948 was self-evident, but that was not how it seemed at the time. Taking such a decision when US Secretary of State General Marshall cautioned the Jews against defeat in the war, saying, "We won't come to your help." When the Haganah Chief of Staff was reporting that the chances of victory were no more than 50-50. And while the Americans were demanding that the decision be postponed for a few months, was not an easy thing. It was only Ben-Gurion's powers of persuasion that led to a 6-4 majority in the provisional government in favor of independence. The decision was carried by 1 vote. Just 3 years after the end of the World War, after the Holocaust, he was prepared to take a gamble on the great hope of the Jewish people, the state. He was fully aware of the risks. He was very apprehensive. But as Golda Meir said, he was capable of making difficult decisions, not because he was not afraid, but despite his being afraid. Could anyone else have made a decision that meant sending thousands of young men to their death? There had been no precedent for this in Jewish history since the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century. And now we come to the state. How does one educate a nation that for 2,000 years had not had political rule to accept authority and majority rule? Ben-Gurion was very apprehensive of the Jewish people's anarchistic inclinations, its tendency to dissension, on hair splitting. You know the joke about the Jew who arrived to a deserted island and the first thing he did was building 2 synagogues, one where he prayed and the other when he never goes. Its lack of governmental tradition. It was against this backdrop that the Altalena affair erupted, the Etzel arms vessel that Ben-Gurion ordered to be sunk because he viewed it as a challenge to the army's authority, the authority of the state. This decision drew sharp criticism. How could Jews fight against Jews? But it also set out ground rules that were fully observed throughout Ben-Gurion's terms of office. In recent decades, we have witnessed in Israel minority groups challenging the authority of the state, sometimes successfully. Fortunately, Ben-Gurion's statist legacy still holds firm and is accepted by one and all. On the eve of the establishment of the state, in order to grant broad public legitimacy to the nascent state, he formulated the status quo agreement with the religious parties, giving them authority over marital laws, and he even spoke of preserving the Jewish character of the state in the public sphere. He believed that the ultra-Orthodox would soon disappear, which did not happen. Nevertheless, he scrupulously avoided a total crisis with the religious circles. He crossed swords ideologically with religious politicians and intellectuals, but avoided rupture. During the nation's formative period, he explained, It was crucial to avoid schism among the people. I wonder what he would have to say on this subject today. Ben-Gurion viewed the 1949 borders as sufficient territory for the absorption of all the Jews desiring to come to Israel. He rejected proposals from young belligerent generals to extend the state's borders. We don't need more territory, he stated. We need more Jews. He adhered to this view even after the Six-Day War in 1967, when he stated that all the occupied territories, with the exception of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, should be returned in exchange for peace. Despite his disparaging remarks about the United Nations, you know probably the shmum, which he said about him, he was extremely attentive to world opinion, and throughout his life sought a close relationship with the great democratic power of the United States. However, America of the 1950s turned its back on the young state, refusing to supply it with arms or give it international support. To his dying day, Ben-Gurion was never invited to the White House as an official guest. The state's early years were years of revolution. Excuse me. Thank you. Within 3 years, the population doubled in size and had to be provided with housing, work, and education. The mission of forming a nation out of people from dozens of countries who spoke different languages and who came from a wide range of traditions and cultures was, in Ben-Gurion's eyes, a mission of paramount importance, the true Zionist revolution. But unlike political objectives, which he not only knew how to define, but also to find the levers for their attainment, the objective of forming a nation was more elusive and harder to implement. His attempts in this direction did not gain success to the degree he hoped for. He was not prepared to listen to his advisor, who demanded that immigration be slowed down, since the state was unable to shoulder the burden of immigration absorption. He was also not prepared to hear about selection. Every Jew, he held, can be educated and reach the same cultural level. But he was impatient and did not understand that cultural integration takes longer than forming an army or directing a war. In the end, Ben-Gurion was disappointed with the state he had founded. The chosen people, or a light unto the nations, the slogans he used to voice, did not express reality, but rather an aspiration toward betterment of the state and the creation of a utopian society. It is yet to come into being. Ben-Gurion used to say that he did not do what the people wanted, but what he thought was right for them. This was paternalism, which drew criticism at the time, and certainly would today. But it reflected his willingness to take responsibility and make difficult decisions, which in retrospect, most of the time proved correct. Golda Meir once said, "Every time I opposed him, it turned out in the end that he was right." He possessed a sense of historical opportunity that guided him through his most difficult times. And first and foremost, he had the courage to take calculated risks. Ben-Gurion held that history is not made by leaders, but by the masses, by spontaneous processes. At least he said so. But he would add, at fateful moments, a courageous, resolute leader capable of making hard decisions makes a difference between victory and defeat. He was referring to Churchill, but by the same token, his words are true of himself. Would Ben-Gurion have been able to cope with the complex reality of the 21st century, of an open, almost anarchic society with a variety of diffused foci of authority? Would he have succeeded in dealing with present-day media? Or would the bloggers joke at the slogans he liked to voice, which were indeed pompous if one did not believe in his sincerity? And they would, within a few days, they would have shattered his authority. After the establishment of the state, the aura of the founding father, the victor of the War of Independence, accorded him almost messianic status among the new immigrants. But even then, members of his own party and of course of the opposition had no qualms about undermining his authority, and in the end caused his exit from the political stage, just like the fate of Churchill and de Gaulle. But he bequeathed to the State of Israel and the Jewish people a model of a leader who combined idealism with vision, political wisdom with military daring, caution with the ability to make difficult decisions, responsibility for shaping a nation and national culture. When the Camp David negotiations in 2000 between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat collapsed, one of the Palestinians remarked, "We needed a Ben-Gurion, but we have got Arafat." At present, in a time of leadership that shies away from making decisions and submits to pressure, a leadership that every day examines its image in the public opinion polls that change with the latest TV news, we yearn for Ben-Gurion. Thank you.